All right, guys, this is like the first lecture I'm recording since summertime, so hopefully I remember how to do this. And I actually know you guys now, so I will try to make this as short as I need to. Um, all right, so objective 2.6 is passive transport through the plasma membrane. And in the book, that would be section 5.2 and 5.3. And as you guys know, this part's mostly review. Passive transport is the movement of molecules from a high concentration to a low concentration. So anytime something's going from high to low, you don't need to supply energy. It's passive transport. All right, and there's a lot of things in the cell that are brought in and out by passive transport, and we'll talk about a few of those. So let's see where I have. Let me go through this one first, a simple diffusion animation. Okay, here we have a substance that's in high concentration on one side of the phospholipid bilayer and low concentration on the other side. So as you would predict, it's able to cross the membrane until eventually it reaches their equilibrium, relatively equal sides on either side. Oxygen is one of the molecules that does that very easily. I think there's mainly two that I want you to know about. Oxygen and carbon dioxide get across very easily. So the membranes of our lungs, oxygen can pass through, carbon dioxide can pass through. There's other examples of things that are also small and non-polar that can get across. Water's polar, but it's small enough that sometimes it creeps across I don't say creeps across, but comes across in small quantities. To get large quantities of water across, you're going to need aquaporins to do that. Let's see what else they have. Okay. So things that are small or nonpolar, so lipid soluble substances. No energy needed from high to low. So very straightforward, but just remember, especially for oxygen and carbon dioxide, are going to get across the membrane by passive transport directly through the membrane. Okay. So here is an example. You have oxygen getting across, carbon dioxide getting across, small amounts of water, not too much. I like this example really better here. It shows oxygen getting across. This is the cells of your lung, CO2 being taken to go get more oxygen from the lungs, if that's a tissue. And that has to happen for the lungs too. They have to get rid of wastes and get new oxygen as well. All right. The next one I want to talk about is facilitated diffusion. And I'm going to bring up an animation that's going to show aquaporins. I don't believe I've done this animation before, and maybe in regular bio I have. But watch what happens here. Let me describe on this picture first before I show the animation. All right, so in the channel protein has its tertiary structure, and in the middle of the channel there are some positive amino acids, and they're going to attract the negative parts of the water molecule, the oxygen, the partial negative, and flip it down. So it's going to be a very selective, narrow channel for water. So large amounts of water are going to need to come in through aquaporins. So examples of cells in your body that have a lot of aquaporins would be like your kidneys, but they're present in other types of cells as well, which I'll show in this. Hopefully this is a YouTube animation. And hopefully all the links still work. Oh, this is a short one, unless that's the ad. Nope, that's... I guess there's no sound with it, so I have to kind of animate it. But you notice there's a lot of water here, and it's going to go from high to low. It's a narrow channel. Oops. Kind of just cut off there. And it's selective for water. So these channels are usually very selective for what they're bringing in. And then I have another one as well, I believe. Aquaporins. There, this is the one I was thinking of that I might have shown before. It's like a claymation.
Aquaporins were first discovered by a team of researchers led by Peter Ager at Johns Hopkins University in the early 90s. Peter's team was studying membrane proteins in red blood cells. In the process of their research, they identified a protein that they thought was a water channel. To test this hypothesis, they inserted the protein into the cell membrane of frog eggs and then dropped the eggs into water. As water entered the egg cells through the water channels, the modified eggs swelled up and burst open, confirming their hypothesis. Aquaporins are integral membrane proteins that allow water molecules to passively move from one side of the membrane to the other. In this animation, a red aquaporin subunit is seen spanning a pink membrane. The blue and white represent the oxygen and 2 hydrogens in water, the yellow is chloride, and the purple is potassium. Watch how only water is able to pass through the aquaporin and down its concentration gradient. Now let's take a closer look at the structure of the aquaporin that gives rise to its unique function. Each aquaporin subunit is formed by 6 alpha helices bundled together. The inside of a channel is lined with negatively charged residues that allow for hydrogen bonding between the water molecule and the protein.
All right, so notice that you have the way most of the channel is got a negative charge lined with it, and that would cause the partial positives of the hydrogen to be attracted to those negative charges. And then when it reaches the positive charge, it's going to flip it and keep the water moving in that direction.
Until the molecule reaches the center of the protein, where it is flipped by the positive charge around 2 asparagines. This change in orientation allows only water molecules to fit through the aquaporin, making it a highly specific channel. In this animation, the white negative signs represent the negatively charged lining of an aquaporin channel, and the purple plus sign represents the...
Okay, so it's still high to low, so it does not require energy. This is called facilitated diffusion because this protein is still high to low, so it's not going to require energy, so it's still diffusion, but it's called facilitated diffusion because it needs this protein channel in order to cause mostly the water to get through. Facilitated diffusion, still high to low, needs the membrane protein there to facilitate it. Not simple diffusion like oxygen. Oxygen doesn't need a channel protein, but it's still going high to low, so the aquaporins, water in large quantities, needs to come in through facilitated diffusion. Okay. And another way in which we see very good example of facilitated diffusion is through these chlorine channels. So what happens in our byproduct of our metabolism is we produce a lot of chlorine. And the chlorine channel is going to get that from an area of high concentration to low concentration, take chlorine out of the cell. So in people who have mutations in this chlorine transporter, what happens is chlorine builds up in the cell, and then water, which we know water goes from high to low, water is going to leave the outside of the cell, which is the mucus, and go into the cell and cause the cells to swell. So the cell swelling is one problem, but another major problem is, think about your mucus. Hopefully nobody's been sick recently, but you can remember when you've been sick, you have a mucus and you cough that up and it helps trap nasty bacteria and stuff. But think about it if your mucus was very thick, because if it loses its water, imagine chlorine. I'm going to try to animate this or annotate it somehow. Imagine chlorine is building up inside the cell here. And water's going to be high on the outside, low on the inside. Water's going to leave the outside and go in the cell, and then the mucus becomes like dried out paste, very thick. And now these cells, which normally these cilia help move things in and out of the lungs, become very, like a very thick mucus, very difficult to cough up. People who have this mutation, there's hundreds of different mutations. This was the first protein that was ever cloned and sequenced, and they knew a lot about it. It stands for cystic fibrosis transmembrane regulatory protein. And people who have mutations in that have in two copies, mutations in two copies, so it's recessive disorder, have cystic fibrosis. And I don't want to talk too much about cystic fibrosis, but because I do spend a lot of time talking about it in ninth grade bio. But people who have cystic fibrosis, they have very bad coughing, and they have to take a lot of medications. People have to pound on their chest, or the back of their chest, to loosen up the mucus. They can even wear a vest that helps like vibrate the mucus out. Lots of medications. The only treatment that, well, actually there have been some treatments that recently have been pretty successful for a very select small number of patients. That's the problem. I've been reading about a couple people, somebody I know who knows somebody's daughter's been in and out of the hospital for her whole life with cystic fibrosis, and she's taken this medication and now she's off to college and doing really well, but that's only a small subset of the patients, but that's really good news. Person who has cystic fibrosis, they can, if their lungs get really bad where they're constantly just on oxygen all the time, their doctor might recommend them for a lung transplant. Problem is with the lung transplant, they have to, imagine if you took your lungs out, they have to cut somebody all the way down and then remove those lungs. So they're already in a very bad state when they need a lung transplant. And I think the estimated is like 50% of people who get lung transplants end up dying very shortly, unfortunately, after the transplant attempt, because just that their body wasn't strong enough or they rejected the lungs. Even just taking medications to prevent you from rejecting transplants is very, very tough on the body. So that's another example of a transport protein facilitated diffusion. Chlorine is high on the inside, low on the outside. It's going to move from high to low. That's the normal situation. Imagine that transporter's not there. Chlorine builds up. Water that was on the outside then comes in, and the mucus becomes thick, and that is over the tissues in the lungs. So the lungs can't move things as easily. Also on the pancreas, so the insulin can't be sent out into the body correctly. So a lot of times, almost always, people who have cystic fibrosis have to take insulin shots as well. Their body's making the insulin, it's just getting caught in that very thick mucus. Okay, so let's see here. I think that's it for this section on passive transport. So mostly should be review for you guys. And that's that. I hope that was helpful. I decided to just show an animation for this instead of trying to animate what I already talked about. This actually doesn't have sound, so I have to narrate it anyways. Okay. They're highlighting the systems that are affected. It's going to be a lot of the body systems, but mostly the lungs. Pancreas. This is actually a good just a review for us right now. So it's highlighting the systems that are affected: the large intestine, the pancreas, the liver, and the lungs. And they're going to kind of just show us a cutaway of the lungs. And so this is what we're seeing here. This is the tubes of your lungs. And there's some different cell types here. And this is the mucus that is flowing. And these are particles, are things like mostly bacteria, but could be really anything that's like an irritant. And normally these cilia move and are able to flush out any things that are settling into our lungs. Okay, so here it's showing that there is chlorine on the inside of the cell that is being taken to the outside from high to low through this transport protein from high to low. So energy is not required. This is still facilitated diffusion. Just keep that in mind. Anytime energy is not required, high to low, but you do require a channel protein, that's facilitated diffusion. Okay, that's the normal situation. Okay. Let's look at the situation where the chlorine channel's there, but it doesn't work. It's not opening up, or you're supposed to have 3 channels per every section of membrane that you're looking at, and you only have 1. So that happens sometimes. So chlorine is going to build up, and watch what's going to happen to that water. Water is going to go from high to low. Chlorine is building up on the insides. That means that there's less water in the cell now when chlorine builds up, and water is going to rush into those cells, cause them to swell, and cause that mucus to be thick. Imagine a thick paste over these cells that normally are brushing things out of the lungs. So that's the water going across. This is some sort of treatment that helps function it. So I'm gonna leave that off. Like I said, that there's gonna be some treatments that end up working. Just remember that if you have a buildup of chlorine, then water is going to go from high on the outside to inside to try to kind of dilute that chlorine. But in the process of that happening, the mucus becomes very thick. There's other ways the cells can use to get rid of the chlorine. So it's not like that cell is necessarily going to die from having too much chlorine in it. But the mucus will become thickened, and that's the main issue. Okay, so that is that. Just wanted to show that because it was I thought a good animation.